The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in American history. But why is it known for the carnage it produced above all other American wars? Certainly, every American war both before and after the Civil War had its fair share of carnage, but all the right ingredients came together for an all-out bloodbath. This was a time in our country's history where outdated tactics and untimely medical care led to the death of hundreds of thousands of young men. Several centuries before the outbreak of the American Civil War, conflicts had been fought using firearms such as the smoothbore musket, as well as the cannon. The most notable commander prior to the Civil War was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had great military success due to his understanding of the weapons of that time. For decades, military academies in the United States studied Napoleon's tactics. Officer cadets were taught about linear formations with men carrying smoothbore muskets. In a very disciplined manner, the infantrymen would be given the order to aim their weapons and fire in unison at the enemy position. This massed firepower was the most effective way to deliver the greatest damage to the enemy. This was generally done at a range of 50 yards or less due to the smoothbore musket's great inaccuracy. Rifled muskets had existed well before the outbreak of the Civil War but were very unpopular with the military. They were long and cumbersome and took an extremely long time to reload, but this was all about to change. In 1846, a French army officer by the name of Claude-Étienne Minié designed a conical projectile that was slightly smaller in diameter than the barrel of the rifle. This allowed the soldier to place the bullet in the barrel and ram the ball home with his ramrod very quickly. The base of the projectile was hollow, and when the powder ignited inside the barrel of the rifle, the soft lead expanded to catch into the grooves of the rifling in the barrel. This new projectile became known as the mini-ball. Not only could a soldier load his weapon much faster than with the traditional smoothbore musket, he could accurately hit targets at 200 yards. In fact, there are several accounts of soldiers being hit farther than 200 yards. The sheer size of the mini-ball was massive. Calibers varied throughout the Civil War from 54 caliber to 69 caliber. One of the most common caliber sizes was 58. To put this into perspective, the modern United States military infantryman uses a bullet that is less than 1/4 of an inch wide. A 58 caliber mini ball was over half an inch wide. This, as one can imagine, would cause absolutely devastating wounds when it entered the human body. When a mini ball was fired from a rifled musket, the soft lead was heated in a manner to where it became very malleable. This means it would not maintain its conical shape when it struck a target. This led to major entry wounds without the presence of an exit wound. Skin, muscle, and tissue would be shredded, and bone became splintered and fragmented beyond repair. Unfortunately for the victims of the mini-ball, death was often not a quick process. Oftentimes it would take several hours, even days, for a mini-ball to finish its work. The wounded soldier would have to lay, waiting in pain while he slowly died of blood loss. Brought to a field hospital, head, chest, and torso wounds were considered fatal, and all that could be done was to make the victim as comfortable as possible. For those wounded in an extremity like the arm or a leg, a very long road to recovery was before them. There was a very real chance they would still not survive. Though amputation was the surgery of choice to remove a destroyed limb, the risk of bacteria infecting the wound and spreading throughout the body was high. Artillery was another technology that terrorized both the officer and enlisted men on both sides during the Civil War. Old model brass smoothbore cannons were still in use on both sides and still quite effective. The Union Army started to employ rifled cannons as well. Brass cannons could have a range of roughly 1 mile, and their iron rifled counterparts could have roughly a range of 2 miles with the proper projectile. There were many different forms of projectiles that could be fired out of these cannons. Some of the most commonly used were solid shot, explosive shell, and canister. Solid shot was a single solid projectile that could be fired over a great distance. The round would often skip and ricochet, bowling over anyone in its path. Explosive shot was a projectile fired that had a fuse that would ignite powder inside, causing an explosion. Though the shock wave of the explosion was extensive and lethal, the metal shards inside the projectile dispersed in a wide area. Anyone who was in the relative vicinity of where a shell exploded was at risk from being hit from this shrapnel. The psychological effect of explosions happening all around a man made this one of the most feared weapons of the Civil War, as well as every war thereafter. Canister shot was perhaps the most effective in deterring infantry at a close range. It was also one of the most brutal and horrifying. A canister projectile contained hundreds of smaller projectiles, oftentimes in the shape of a ball, and operated virtually the same way a shotgun operates. Only this shotgun was the size of a Civil War cannon. At 400 yards or less, the hundreds of smaller projectiles would spread out and mow down anything in their path. Let's look at a scenario. You marched up with your regiment to within range of the enemy position. After firing a couple rounds, you feel an immense pressure in your left leg and cannot stand. You instantly lose your balance and fall to the ground. A mini ball has hit you below the left knee. The firing continues, and your regiment advances, leaving you behind. You see another friendly line of men marching towards you. You shout as loudly as you can for help as they draw nearer. You receive a couple pitiful glances and perhaps, if you're lucky, a swig or two of the water from a canteen or a flask of whiskey. But the line of men continues to march on. They have strict orders not to stop for wounded men. This would take up too much of the regiment's time and manpower while under fire. You look around and notice other comrades of yours wounded. Some of them are already trying to crawl back to friendly lines. Others are hurt so badly all they can do is cry out for help. You decide to try and crawl back to your own lines. There is an unquenchable thirst like you have never experienced before in your life. If they're close enough in your journey back, you may be lucky enough to steal a few ounces of water from a slain comrade's canteen. You've been crawling for what seems like a century and are on the verge of passing out from exhaustion when suddenly 2 young men hoist you onto a stretcher and take you to a field hospital. From the time you were shot to the time you arrive at the field hospital, 4 hours has elapsed. It was an all too common occurrence during the American Civil War that a wounded soldier would be left on the battlefield to fend for themselves. As the war progressed, the United States Army reformed its ambulance corps. These reforms included new organization as well as training to the Teamsters on basic battlefield triage. The ability to get a wounded soldier from the battlefield to the field hospital in a timely manner greatly improved the chances of survival. Unfortunately, even with the advances in the ambulance corps, there were many situations throughout the Civil War where wounded men had to be left on the field until it was safe to recover them. The time could range from a few hours to days at a time. Makeshift tourniquets and bandages were often the only treatment a soldier received while on the battlefield. The hazards of enemy rifle fire and explosions from artillery still existed as much for the wounded man as they did for the ones still standing. Additionally, the wounded soldier ran into different hazards on the battlefield. During the Battle of Fredericksburg in mid-December 1862, thousands of Union troops lay in a large field where several assaults had been attempted that day. The Confederate position had the men pinned down, lying prone to avoid certain death. At nighttime, temperatures dipped well below freezing and many of the wounded men succumbed to hypothermia. The Battle of the Wilderness in 1864 bears one of the most horrifying accounts of the entire war. It had been a very dry Virginia summer, and the fighting had been very intense. Several forest fires soon broke out across the battlefield. The wounded soldiers who could not move or could not move fast enough were burned alive. To many veterans, their cries were the most haunting memories of the entire war. To continue this scenario, you've reached the field hospital within 4 hours of being wounded. This is relatively fast for the Civil War. You are laid down on a thin layer of straw in the front yard of a modest-looking home. There appears to be dozens, perhaps even 100 other wounded men in the yard. You spot a nurse making his way through the crowd of wounded men. He approaches you with a bottle of whiskey and you happily consume a few sips. He then examines your leg and informs you of the likelihood of an amputation. Panic sets in as you hear these words. In an America where the only experience you had was performing manual labor jobs, how were you going to make a living? As the hours drag on and the brief pain relief from the whiskey wears off, you sit there in agony. It appears that several of the men who are lying out in the yard are already dead. It's well into the early morning now when a few men hoist you onto another stretcher and take you into the house. They take you to the dining room of the home where you are placed on the table. The physician approaches, blood covering his clothes from all the work performed that day. A very brief examination of your wound takes place. Suddenly, a nurse is holding a cylinder-shaped piece of metal over your nose and mouth. He tells you to breathe in, and then blackness. Amputations were by far the most common surgery during the Civil War. The mini ball destroyed the bone so violently that it was left beyond repair in most cases. There is a common misconception in modern times that amputations were performed due to the lack of medical knowledge. Amputations actually provided the best chance of survival for the victim. If the limb was not amputated, infection would likely occur, and the pain would be astronomical, not to mention the limb was completely useless, as there was no chance of the bones growing back together. Another common misconception today is that these operations were performed without any anesthetics. In fact, anesthetics had been invented well before the Civil War, and their use during surgical operations was common. There were several different types of anesthetics, but the two most common were chloroform and ether. Administering these anesthetics was simple. Medical staff simply had the patient inhale the vapors produced, and the patient would become unconscious quickly. So in this scenario, you are now unconscious on the operating table that just so happens to be the dining room table of the family that owns this home. Now let's talk about what the surgeon is doing while you are sleeping. He observes that the ball hit you mid-shin. He then inserts a medical instrument into the wound. The tip of this instrument is made of pewter, and if it comes in contact with a soft lead bullet, there will be residue. He is unable to locate a bullet, but can clearly see the bone is shattered in many places. A tourniquet is then applied above your left knee. This will stop all blood flow to the rest of your leg. A sharp knife is then used to cut through your skin and muscle down to the bone above your wound. This is done in a circular fashion, leaving the bone exposed. A saw is then used to cut through the bone, and below the knee, the leg is removed. After this, a file is used to smooth out the bone, and skin is folded over and stitched together to cover the stump. Bandages are then applied, and you are moved to another room in the house. The entire process from the time you arrived on the table to the time you were laid in the other room was about 20 minutes. From 1861 to 1865, over 50,000 other men would have to go through this same trauma. Though the experience was traumatizing and hellish, it was the best chance these men had at survival. If you are lucky, you will spend your time recovering in a hospital in Richmond or Washington, D.C. You avoid disease and infection, and in the coming months you are discharged from the Army and sent home. To call a Civil War field hospital a nightmare is an understatement. They were often understaffed and overworked. The number of casualties being brought back from the battlefield was unlike any that had ever been seen before in world history. The medical personnel in both the Northern and Southern armies could never have predicted what was in store for them. For many soldiers, the fear of the surgeons saw greatly outweighed the fear of the enemy's gunfire. The experiences we have explored so far when it comes to wounds on the battlefield are gruesome and hard to stomach, but there was a different, much more mysterious killer that was always lurking in the shadows. This killer came in the form of diseases. Men from across the country were gathering into close quarters with one another, many of whom were very young and lacked any knowledge in basic hygiene. Statistically speaking, the army camp life was even more lethal than the battlefield. In the early stages of the war, sanitation practices were highly lacking. Human waste, rotting animal carcasses, and various other infectious material would often be placed in close proximity where men bathed and where food was prepared. At the time, germs had not yet been discovered, and how diseases were spread was still not greatly understood. These were the type of conditions to create a stronghold for diseases. Think about a time when you, or someone in the home where you're living, came down with some type of sickness. Odds are, eventually, everyone in the household came down with the same illness. Now, picture this same phenomenon happening to an army camp with over 100,000 people. If you served in the Civil War, you had an extremely high chance of contracting some type of illness. The sicknesses during the time of the Civil War were numerous. Pneumonia, scarlet fever, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, gangrene, the flu, and many more potentially lethal illnesses plagued both armies throughout the war. A particular illness that tends to stand out when we review Civil War medical documentation is dysentery. A person develops dysentery when they ingest the bacteria. A soldier could have his hands contaminated with the bacteria and then eat a meal. Water that was unsafe for drinking from local streams, lakes, or ponds would oftentimes be consumed and highly tainted with the bacteria. Even swimming and bathing in rivers and streams that contained the bacteria ran the risk of contracting dysentery. For soldiers who were unfortunate enough to contract this disease, treatment was very limited. In terms of medicine, there was virtually nothing that helped. In fact, sometimes the medicine made the condition even worse. Pills containing mercury were commonly prescribed to treat many illnesses, including dysentery. The best thing a physician could do for a man was to prescribe a diet of water and hardtack. A bland palate would somewhat ease the man's suffering from the constant diarrhea and dehydration brought on by the disease. For tens of thousands of troops, they met their demise in field hospitals while suffering the effects of dysentery. What we now know about dysentery is that the patient needs constant hydration. Fresh, uncontaminated water was a must for survival. But as we have previously explored, medical staff on both the Union and the Confederacy were almost constantly overwhelmed with patients and were extremely understaffed. 2/3 of all deaths during the Civil War were from disease, not the battlefield. Even with the unprecedented amount of human suffering the Civil War caused, there was still a great deal of humanity demonstrated by both military and civilian personnel throughout those terrible 4 years. Many men and women volunteered their time and welfare to assist in saving lives and ease suffering. A private relief agency was started in the summer of 1861 called the United States Sanitary Commission. This organization focused on care for wounded and sick soldiers and was the front runner for improving both hospital and camp living conditions. It was not just the physical care of soldiers that the commission was concerned with. They also prioritized the moral and spiritual wellness for those serving in the conflict. The United States Sanitary Commission, along with countless other groups, did everything they could to provide some type of relief to the men enduring the hardships the war was bringing them. Throughout most of history to that point in time, it was not typically viewed as appropriate for a woman to serve as a nurse in field hospitals. These feelings were contributed to societal views that women were too delicate to view firsthand the effects of war. It had also been viewed, since wounded and dying men in field hospitals would often have little to no clothes on, that the presence of women was inappropriate. The need for medical personnel and the willingness of thousands of selfless women allowed for the first time in American history women to be very involved in military hospital work. They provided the vital care that wounded, sick, and dying soldiers needed, enduring the same hardships as their male counterparts. In a time where women's rights were still widely restricted, American women showed the nation and the world that a woman's role could venture far outside of the home and into the war zone. It would be impossible in this short video to give the appropriate amount of credit for all of the notable women who served their country during the Civil War. Perhaps the most famous was Clara Barton. Clara Barton served as a nurse from the beginning of the war to the very end. She was steadfast in her duties and made countless improvements to Army nursing as a whole. To the armies of the Union, she became known as the Angel of the Battlefield. After the war, her most notable achievement was the formation of the American Red Cross. It is an undeniable fact that the loss of life during the Civil War occurred on a massive scale, but without the selfless efforts of thousands of men and women serving in the medical capacity, this loss would have certainly been much greater than it already was. It's important not to forget that these individuals not only worked in hazardous conditions for days at a time without rest, but that, for many of them, they lived amongst the troops they were serving, which put them at just as much risk for contracting the deadly diseases that existed in the camps. There are clearly many factors as to why the American Civil War was the costliest conflict in our nation's history. The art of taking life was vastly beyond the art of saving life. The now common use of the rifled musket exponentially increased the number of casualties in each battle, both large and small. Diseases that were still not quite understood were rampant, and the medicine was inadequate. Many historians today believe that the actual death toll from the American Civil War may be closer to 1 million. There are undoubtedly shallow graves still left undiscovered, serving as the final resting place for those unknown soldiers who met their demise from wounds on the battlefield and from diseases in the camps. The conflict as a whole led to many improvements in battlefield medicine that ultimately led to the establishment of the modern military medical practices the United States has today. The men who suffered through these experiences paved the way for soldiers of the future to have a better chance of surviving wounds and diseases, so that they may one day return home.